Hey everyone, welcome back to Wildcat Academy. Today we are going to be learning about deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is the process of using logic to draw conclusions or prove conjectures true using facts. Deductive reasoning is the main type of reasoning we use in geometry. Now by comparison, we compare that to inductive reasoning. So it's a process of reasoning that something is true by proving that specific cases are true and then making a conjecture. So one determines a series of logic. A leads us to B, leads us to C, whereas inductive reasoning, we might just show 2 or 3 examples explaining and then make a conjecture based on those examples that it's going to be true in all cases. In deductive reasoning, we can take given facts and apply logic and then result in a true conclusion. And that's going to be really important as we enter in into proving theorems and other conjectures that we're going to make in geometry. So we have 2 laws of logic. The first law is the law of detachment, and it simply says if P implies Q is true, and P is true, then Q has to be true. Now, that's really complicated when we write it in that way, but basically we have some if-then statement, P implies Q, and then we meet the hypothesis. So we know it's very important that the if-then statement is true, and once we know that, if we have a true hypothesis, then we can make the conclusion that we know Q to be true. So let's look at an example of that. It says determine if the conjecture is valid or invalid. So we have the if-then statement. If you live in California, then you live in the Pacific time zone. Then we know that Jill lives in California. So we started with a true if-then statement, and then we have a fact that we know to be true. Jill lives in California. And then we can make the conjecture using our if-then statement because we have met the hypothesis. We have someone that lives in California. Therefore, we can make the conclusion or conjecture that Jill lives in the Pacific time zone. And so we can conclude that that conjecture is valid. Now let's look at another example. We're looking for the same thing. We're going to determine if the conjecture is valid or invalid. So we start with if you study for the test, then you make a good grade. So in example 2, we're going to be determining if our conjecture is true based off this if-then statement and then a fact that we know to be true. So if you study for the test, then you make a good grade. That's our if-then. That is our P implies Q. And then we know that Jack made a good grade on the test. Well, this is actually the conclusion here. So we haven't met the hypothesis, so our conjecture that Jack studied for the test, we cannot assume that Jack studied for the test because we have not met the hypothesis of our if-then. He may have studied for the test, but we don't know that. We cannot assume in backwards logic that was that's why he made a good grade on his test. So this is an invalid conjecture or conclusion. So let's look at example 3. If it is Friday, then it is not the weekend. So we have our P implies Q, and then we have a statement, it is Thursday. Well, once again, in order to make a conjecture based off that if-then statement, we had to meet the hypothesis or the P statement. We had to know that that is true. So in this case, we have not met that hypothesis. So we cannot conclude anyway, cannot make a valid conjecture. So this again is another reason why this statement would be invalid. Now our second law of logic is the law of syllogism. And this one states if P implies Q and Q implies R are true, so we have 2 true if-then statements, then we can connect those with a chain of logic that P implies R is true. So again, breaking that down into something that is really a little bit more straightforward, we have if-then statement 1, if-then statement 2. The conclusion of the first is the hypothesis of the second. So you can imagine that we just skip the Q statement here and we can jump from P implies R. And that's the law of syllogism. It's very similar if you've already studied the transitive property. It's that kind of transitive property thought process that there is an intermediate step that we can then connect our step 1 to step 3. So we want to, an example, let's examine an example here. So write a statement using the law of syllogism. If a quadrilateral is a rhombus, then it is a parallelogram. And if a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then its opposite sides are congruent. So we have the hypothesis here, and then we have a conclusion down here that we're going to connect with the same statement in the middle, that same connecting piece of logic. It's the conclusion of the first if-then statement and the hypothesis of the second statement, if-then statement, and therefore we can then rewrite and leave out that middle logic step, that if a quadrilateral is a rhombus, then its opposite sides are congruent, where it's just the P and the R, and you see that the Q statement is what allowed us to connect P and R. Let's look at a couple more examples here. In example 5, we have if a natural number is divisible by 2, then it is even. And then if a natural number is even, then it ends in 0, 2, 4, 6, or 8. So you can see that we have this Q statement right here that's the conclusion of the first if-then, but the hypothesis of the second. That allows us to write a P implies R statement using the law of syllogism. If a natural number is divisible by 2, then it ends in 0, 2, 4, 6, or. 2 more examples here. Determine if the conjecture is valid or invalid using the law of syllogism. So again, we are looking for that P implies R situation from 2 different if-then statements with the Q connecting statement. If you go to the movies, then you will buy popcorn. And then if you buy popcorn, then you will buy a drink. So our connecting statement is if you buy popcorn. So we can see that if you go to the movies, then you will buy a drink. That's our conjecture. Therefore, we have a valid use of the law of syllogism. In example 7, if a figure is a rectangle, then it is a parallelogram. And then our second if-then statement is if a figure is a square, then it is a parallelogram. Both of these are true statements. However, we cannot use the law of syllogism to make a conjecture based on this information, because if it is a parallelogram is the statement that repeats, but it's the conclusion of both statements. Individually, we could go back and use the law of detachment if we had some information about one of these hypotheses, but we don't have that situation. So we have tried to make a conjecture. If a figure is a rectangle, then it is a square, which is in itself a false statement. That is sometimes true, but not an always statement. So our conjecture in this case is invalid. We cannot use the law of syllogism to make a comparison between these two if-thens. If you've enjoyed the video, hit the like button below and don't forget to subscribe, and look out for other videos from Wildcat Academy.